my name is Karen, and I want to welcome all of you to our Wednesday Climate Action Coffee. We are TALLE, Takoma Alliance for Living Economy, which is a group of Takoma Park Mobilization, which was formed right after Trump came into office and works on social justice in many forms. TALLE was we created TALLE to embrace the social justice agenda and to focus on our local issues around land use and local economies. Then we heard the voices of our children demanding us to save the planet. We knew our mission had to be seen through the lens of climate change and racial and economic equity. So here we are. We meet every Wednesday morning. I want to thank Andy Shalal and Busboys and Poets for giving us this space and free coffee. Yes. So every Wednesday morning, 7:30 in the morning, we are here to continue the discussion around issues of climate change. In the first Wednesdays of the month, we are devoted to bringing in resource people, welcome resource people, who are knowledgeable about the issues to join our conversation and offer us guidance to our actions, because we are a very action-oriented group. Well, we will be. We're just starting. So we have a lot of info in a short amount of time. We will be taking questions and answering. Please make sure they're succinct. And I want to propose that we use the group agreements of Takoma Park Mobilization. We want to assume good intent from people when they're talking. Move up, move back, which means if you talk a lot, talk a little less. If you talk a little less, talk a lot more. Respect each other, listen, no hate speech, use appropriate language, embrace the work and the journey. This is a journey of a lifetime. So we really need to frame that. Americans aren't used to that lifetime journey. So we need to know that it doesn't have to happen tomorrow. Well, it does have to happen tomorrow and every day thereafter. So pace ourselves. Coffee is free. It's over here. If you want breakfast, you can order it. We have James and Amina, who are our servers, and they'll take your order if you want breakfast. You can do it now or you could do it after. We can stay in here after 9, after the program is over. The bathrooms are out this door and to the right. So, welcome. And Phil is our moderator, so I'll hand it over to Phil.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased you're all here. There's a lot of talent in the room, not only our resource people, but others here who have been engaged with these issues for many years and whose focus is being sharpened by what's happening in the wider world. We thought we might have a few more people, but in terms of doing introductions, why don't you find 2 other people near you? Our desired outcomes for this morning are for us to meet each other, to learn a little bit more about what's going on in our region, build our networks, perhaps create some shared vision about how we go ahead, get a sense of what we might do, and perhaps agree on some next steps. For our sort of resource people, I think we shared this with some of you in email before, but sort of framing questions for our discussion are, you know, what is your vision or your organization's vision for where we could go to increase regional food self-sufficiency, improve our regional food equity, accelerate drawdown through ecosystem restoration and regenerative agriculture, and how to see the issues that you're working on connecting with the other issues with us. What can we support that's working? What can we replicate? What things aren't maybe working so well that we can improve, and any suggestions you might have about that. So with that, can I start with Caroline? Can you, each of you as resource persons, maybe spend 5 minutes describing how things look from where you sit?
Well, first of all, thanks for everybody coming this early this morning. My name is Caroline Taylor. I'm the executive director of a small nonprofit called Montgomery Countryside Alliance, and we work out in the Ag Reserve with local producers, with community members to make a robust sort of rural community to make sure that we can produce food and fiber right here in Montgomery County. Now, to answer the question, where do we go? We have a lot of work to do. The two issues that were the centerpieces here that were listed, climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and a more equitable food system are right front and center for us. We are embarking on trying to, with our partners at Sugarloaf Citizens Association, establish a regenerative food demonstration sort of hub. We've been here working with a gentleman from Madison, Wisconsin, who does organic and regenerative dairy farming. He may be the candidate on their 100 acres to teach. But we also know that we have to do more just broadly in terms of making sure our farming practices do more in terms of carbon sequestration. But I also want to make sure that we are all sort of siloed off and we look at our food system in fragments, and I think we have to start looking at us as an entire food system, and that a food system that works together, that we don't just look at the ag reserve as producing our food, we look at urban production, we look at and I'm going to be so interested in hearing about the institutional purchasing of local foods. I was reading about that lately. So our schools, our institutions, our consumers. You want to know action? This TALLE's notion of having a hub here in this area to make sure we can aggregate and distribute food in an equitable way. I am excited about that, and that's all the airtime I'm going to take right now.
I have one follow-up question, which is, I think, key is, how do we build relationships between up-county producers and down-county eaters? What are the networks, and what pathways do we need to reinforce to help support the regenerative side of the agriculture in particular?
So I think a setting like this, or multiple settings like this, where the producers are invited to meet the consumers, to interface, to find out what you are interested in, for you to learn more about them and their products, how they grow, how you would like them to grow, but to sort of break down this perceived by distance barrier between those that produce and those that consume. We've made inroads over time. There are a number of businesses that do source locally and try to get the producers in front of their consumers through the time. Dawson's Market, I think of, is one. There are a number of restaurants. We're working with several restaurants now. But to have these conversations to understand each other better, I think is going to be part of it.
Dan Siston's in our TALLE group. He's our scribe for today. I'm hoping he caught that as an action item, is to have more forums like this, but especially with the farmers and growers in attendance.
Yeah, just be aware of the times of years that you'll time of year you'll get them here, but we can discuss that.
Great. Lori.
Thank you. What an incredible thrill to be here. It is, I could talk about this stuff forever. Phil has heard me talk a little bit. He's like, just like 5 minutes, right? So it's really exciting to have a packed house to talk about food systems and food policy. And we're really, really lucky to have a county executive who joins us on a Wednesday morning. I'm sure he has 100 other places he can
At 8 o'clock.
I'm Lorig Charkoudian. I thought we were the bios. I'm Lorig Charkoudian. I'm a state delegate representing District 20, which is right there. I think many of you are my constituents. Thanks for putting me in the House of Delegates. And we have the county executive here, which is really exciting to have a county executive who's paying enough attention to these issues and looking at how to implement policy. So thanks for joining us. And I know a lot of you, because we've been working on food systems policies well before I had the opportunity to do it as a policymaker with Crossroads Community Food Network, and we have those folks here, and the Food Council and the co-op, and we have the Takoma Park, the Crossroads Community Food Network Shared Use Kitchen around the corner from here. If folks aren't familiar with that, which is a really key piece, the processing locations. It's a small scale example of it, but the processing and the ability to take food and do the value added work is a key piece of the structure. So I want to just back up, and if folks aren't familiar, I think as I'm doing the policy work that I'm doing in climate change and energy and in criminal justice reform, all the areas that I work in, I like to remind folks that it's really important to look back at our history and understand how we got to this point. So I'm not going to talk today mostly about federal food policy, and I'm not going to talk mostly about corporate domination of policymaking and our federal food system. But it's really important when we're talking about what are the local things that we need to do to make the system work in a sustainable local economy, to remember that it's not an accident that we got here. It's not a handout to our local farmers, you know, when we subsidize a processing facility. It's a correction of decades of food policy that are supporting a system that is destroying our health because it subsidizes the cheap corn and the processed foods, that's destroying our environment because it prioritizes pesticide-laden, commercial fertilizer-laden, driving trucks back and forth across the country. It's destroying our economies with cheap labor and folks not able to sustain their families on what they're earning, and it's destroying local agricultural land as it shifts towards more and more massive farming and less small farming. So it's important to have that as the context, and if you're not familiar with the history of federal subsidies and food policy over the years, it's important to sort of become familiar with that so we understand how we are here now, and maybe that's a future topic. Someone who knows history, I think I know, just to be dangerous. Someone who knows that, it's worth understanding that. So with that in mind, I think coming to where we are now, one of the things that is so exciting about food policy is when we start to do it right, we can address all of these issues at the same time. When we start to do it right, we can address our physical health and access to healthy food for everybody in our community. When we're doing it right, we are building strong local economies. When we're doing it right, we're fixing with regenerative agriculture and also with just shortening the food miles that food has to travel, we're addressing climate change issues, and we're doing the preservation of land and then also issues around building small local businesses and all of the positive effects that has. So that's kind of big picture stuff. I think some of the issues that I'm working on, and I'm happy to talk more about it, is I have been working on, I have had legislation and will continue to on cottage food. Is Suzanne here? Suzanne, the leader on our cottage food bill last year. Really looking at what are the structural things that need to change. I know in Montgomery County there's a look at what are the regulatory things that need to change that really, while still supporting health, the health departments need to make sure that we don't get poisoned. Also really making sure that those regulations aren't keeping the small producers, the farmers, from doing the value added and the small producers from getting into the market. So we've done some legislative work around that piece, and we'll keep working on that part of it. The other sort of, on the other end of the spectrum, really looking at institutional procurement. So right now, most of the state agencies and most of the Montgomery County agencies, we were just at the the public school system meeting was that 2 days ago? Yeah, a lot that's happened since then. Yes, 2 days ago we were at MCPS listening to the 100,000 reasons that they couldn't possibly purchase from a farm that was right down the street from where the MCPS food facility is. And it's the same that we have everywhere. I'm having these conversations with prisons in Maryland, with schools, with hospitals. And it has to do with a number of things, but again, just coming back to what we've built a corporate, a multinational corporate food system, but we've also built our kitchens in all of these institutions so that they primarily take processed food and heat it up. And so that's, like, the way that we design our facilities is a big challenge. The aggregation issues are a challenge, the need to be able to purchase for 165,000 students. There's ways around all of those things, and I'm not going to go into details of the policies that I'm proposing for next year, but I'm happy to talk about those if folks are interested. There's aggregation pieces, there's procurement, there's a lot of procurement law there's a lot of creativity and different things we could do with procurement law, but we haven't had the political will to really push on that, and I think we're starting to push on it at the state level, again, with a couple of pieces that I'll talk about if folks want to. And the last thing that I just want to mention that I'm also working on and happy to talk more about if people want to is the compost infrastructure issue, and so I'm working on that. I've got some legislation coming up this session. We've really sort of been stuck. We've made a little bit of progress in Prince George's County with their county facility that some Montgomery County, Takoma Park, for example, is able to use. But we haven't really moved that forward in a significant way structurally. I mean, there's projects here and there, but we haven't structurally moved that forward in the state in a really significant way. And it's a pretty crucial piece of the climate issues in terms of food waste and the impact of food waste in landfill or in incinerators, as well as losing out on the opportunity to take that and invest it in our soils and the carbon sequestration that it could also offer on the agricultural side.
Thank you. Heather, turn it over to you.
Now I know that you're time sensitive, so I don't know if we need to disrupt this or.
I want to give Mark the first question after you finish talking.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Heather Bruskin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Montgomery County Food Council. For a quick bit of background information on who we are as an organization, again, as a small nonprofit that serves as a central connection point for businesses, nonprofits, concerned residents, and government agencies around food system issues in our county. And so just as Caroline shared, so often food system work or food issues are looked at through individual silos. Is it about hunger? Is it about economic opportunity? Is it about environmental sustainability? But really it's all part of a system that starts with how we produce our food, how we distribute it, how we access it in terms of buying it at stores, or, and then how do we consume it, the nutritional components of that, and then ultimately how do we dispose of it and hopefully capture some of those nutrients of food waste and put them back into the beginning of the cycle. And so there's a lot of different perspectives and opinions on where improvements can be made in each aspect of that cycle. And so the Food Council brings together a variety of perspectives on how can we find shared and agreed upon areas where we can produce improvements in each of those areas of focus. I think we can all recognize that when we talk about food in Montgomery County, it's so often in the context of abundance. We have a third of our land set aside for agricultural work. We have over 200 food producing farms and over 75 food businesses, but the bounty is not equally shared among our county's residents, and there's so much opportunity with the political will that we have to do better, with the resources that we have to ensure that the over 60,000 county residents who are at risk of hunger have equal access to safe, sufficient, nutritious food that's culturally appropriate with dignity. And so how can we leverage these resources to achieve those goals? And the Food Council has been working with the county's HHS and other partners to implement a 5-year food security strategy. Ultimately, it's a much longer game than that, but at least we're getting started in that work. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get to connect with community partners. And as Karen shared, it's the time for action, and I think there's a lot of different ways to plug in. And what I like about looking at food system work is that you can take that and work on it at an individual level, at a household level, and I imagine a lot of folks in this room are already doing that, with looking at where you invest your money, where you source your food from, how are you composting your food at home, but then ultimately we can expand that to what are the practices of the community groups that I work with, what's happening at the schools where my children go, or community groups just like yours that are getting together to work on these issues. And then, as Lorig shared, how can we expand this to the institutions that we engage with, and the county government and our local government and other institutions like our hospitals and our school systems invest a lot of money in food. And so how can we use our voices to encourage those institutions to invest their dollars wherever the access points may be, to get them more access to those market and sales opportunities. And that will require, for growing the amount that these institutions are buying from local producers, investments in infrastructure so that the farmers can have access to a cut and wash facility so that they can prep their butternut squash in little squares that the MCPS needs for creating their butternut squash soup. Or potentially aggregation and distribution infrastructure so that the small farmers who have limited volume can then work together to meet the needs of the higher volume buyers like those hospitals. And so there's policy work to be done there, but the voice of our community is what is really going to drive and these decisions and highlight them as important to constituents and to taxpayers. So I also just want to highlight there's a lot that's happening at the federal level that impacts our community, and while our work is so often really focused in the local, it's pretty clear that the Food Council is going to weigh in on issues like public charge at the federal level, which will impact the way our residents who are food insecure or at risk of food insecurity can access benefits and feel safe in their communities and using the resources they need to feed their families. The individual voices of residents in making comments at the federal level on policy is really, really important. Oftentimes it's just volume, how many people are submitting comments, and oftentimes it's just an effort to slow things down in order to be able to more effectively mobilize advocacy. And so that's, even though we focus local, being very cognizant of what's happening at the federal level, that will change the way we do our work locally and the way we can connect with residents. So, one really quick thing, I have over there a food and beverage guide that highlights food producing farms and packaged food and beverage producers in the county. So if you're already looking for local buying opportunities, that's a good way to get some ideas on where to start.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to Mark, in preparation for this, just to get my head around the issue, I did some research on some of the hard numbers. While it looks like we live in an agriculturally rich, abundant region, my best guess is that 70 to 90% of the food that we eat is trucked in from outside of Montgomery County. There's about, you have better numbers? There was a report that came out from the Council of Governments in January that looked at what our region grows. They admitted they had a hard time sort of identifying actually what the consumption levels were in terms of what's locally sourced versus outside. Per capita in Montgomery County, a little over 1 million people, it works out to about 1/3 of an acre per person. House lots in Takoma Park are about 1/10 or 0.15 of an acre. It's estimated that you need 2 to 5 acres to sustainably feed a family of 4. So clearly we don't have the land area to be self-sufficient. And that the food that does come in relies largely on diesel trucking, to a more limited degree rail for some of the things like grain and soybean that are consumed here. A lot of it is exported. We are probably self-sufficient in poultry products, chickens and eggs, perhaps not much else. Do you have more numbers on that?
I data for self-sufficient. I don't even see chicken coops around here.
Well,
The region.
when you it depends on how you define local.
Yeah.
So if we take it on a multi-state level, then sure.
But then you'd use a trucking.
Yeah. But
The Energy Information Agency last year put out a report that said fossil fuels, particularly oil, petroleum, the source of the diesel fuel, is likely to see a crunch starting in 2023. If you've studied any of the oil fields around the world, a lot of them are now passing peak. The decline rates range from 5% to 14% a year. People are using a rule of thumb of 6 to 8% a year once we go past peak in terms of fossil fuels. Our lifestyle is right now heavily dependent, 80 to 90%, on those fossil fuels. As much as we might like to be living off of renewables, we're not there yet. It's going to take a long time to get there. At 6 to 8% decline rate per year, that means our energy resources coming from fossil fuels declines by half every 10 years. So in 2030, if that's true, say it's 2035, if we're having to constrain what we can support in terms of our standard of living by half, what does that look like? How do we bring back regional self-sufficiency in food production? It clearly can't happen in Montgomery County. We need to do everything we need to do. We will also need to look broader to our partnerships with other counties and larger region. So with that, I'll let Mark take the floor.
Such a broad topic. I'll just say, I think you're going to find electric trucking taking over this industry really quickly. And I think that's going to
Short
change.
haul, not long haul.
No, Musk is out with the 500-mile truck. Other companies, not just Musk, you can dismiss Elon for his craziness, but other real companies are building tractor trailers that are going to be battery powered. And the numbers are good on them because the reduction in repair costs and big savings in fuel. So I'm not, to me, when I look at the sectors we're trying to deal with in terms of reaching zero greenhouse gases by 2035, transportation is the most possible. I can see a way to transportation, provided I can figure out how not to have my electricity produced by natural gas power plants and nuclear power plants. But natural gas trumps diesel and oil and coal. Coal's not the biggest. For us, in Montgomery County, our energy is natural gas and then nuclear and then coal. But coal is smaller than the natural gas component. But none of that's good. So changing that's going to be a problem. There are a couple of things that we're trying to work on. When I was on the council, I pushed putting the food hub up in Poolesville. I still think Poolesville is the right place for the primary food hub because it's closest to where all the farmers are, and so it minimizes the haul from all the farmers. And the idea then was to try to aggregate what people want to do to market there and then be able to distribute out of Poolesville. Now, that didn't happen for some reason. I did not follow up on that, but I still think it's worth exploring. We're also looking at folks in the East County, which is the Route 29 corridor up by White Oak, have asked us to look at a food processing facility and an incubator kitchen. So one thing we're actively looking for is an incubator kitchen and then a food processing facility which lets things go into bottles and cans, or at least bottles, rather than people having to wrap their things and only be able to get their products into, farmers markets. So we're looking for a way to help people go bigger, and we think because all the food processors or co-packing plants, they call it, have left the area, that if we put a co-packing plant in Montgomery County, we would get business from all around the DC area and it would be viable. So we're looking at doing that. I've talked a bit with the farmers about the issue of commodity crops versus food crops. And it's pretty simple. Commodity crops, guaranteed market, some price fluctuations, but basically they do okay. Food products, they don't know what's going to be left in the field and what's going to be used. And I've talked to people who do this, some really interesting characters up there. And I've been in an eggplant field that was filled with eggplant that never got sold. And so it's hard to convince them to just grow food because they don't know who's going to buy the food. So one thing that we've talked about is creating an app that would let restaurants and farmers talk to each other. So a restaurant could say, in April, I would like to have this, and then a farmer could contract, and both would know. One knows they're going to have a supply, and the other one knows they're going to have a customer. So I'd like to be able to do more of that. We're taking the sequestration stuff very seriously. We have this climate task force, and we have 5 pieces of it, and it's amazing. We have over 100, I think it's over 150 people volunteered to serve on these committees, which is really fascinating. And so we've got a committee on transportation, residential construction, and commercial construction. We added one on sequestration and adaptation, and then one on publicity. We hope when the report comes out that everybody then joins the outreach piece of it, because we're not going to be able to do this in the county without a real serious outreach effort. But we're looking at the sequestration committee to come up with some solutions that we can do. The good news is Montgomery County farmers lead the state in cover cropping. They're pretty good about that. And some of the people who I know is most politically conservative are drilling through the stuff they use as a cover crop and actually planting. And I've seen their machine, and it's kind of impressive. They're trying to reduce their inputs of fertilizer and bad stuff because it costs them money. And so they've got the ability to map on 10 square foot plots and decide what should go on each plot. It's not what I would like, which is organic, but it's an improvement over just taking a field and just throwing everything over the entire field, not knowing whether it's too much or too little. So some of that continues to evolve. We're going to try to play a role in incubator kitchens and incubator restaurants. We think that the county can help find ways to process things that are locally grown, and we're going to work to strengthen ties with farmers so they can think of us as partners. That's one thing they don't think of the government as is the partner. These are folks who the government is not here to help me. And, I mean, the enormous blowback they did against our bill on cosmetic pesticides, because they looked at that bill as the nose under the camel's tent would be coming after their farms next. So building relationships with them it's a long-term process. So we're trying to do it, and I'm a little bit scary to them, but I also have been really supportive of them on agricultural issues. So it's a mixed bag, but I think we're going to be able to get there. What I'm looking for I have to go to another meeting, I have to leave here at 8, but what I want is much information coming in as possible. Carolyn, you're on the sequestration task force?
I'm on 2 other of your task force. But
So there are people on these task forces.
I'm on the
okay. So we need this information to start coming in. The transformation of agriculture is going to take some time. I would say I'm a big fan of the Democracy Collaborative and their project in Cleveland, where they built a laundry that's run by prisoners that does all the Cleveland Clinic's laundry. But they also put up greenhouses around the city, and they do 1 million heads of lettuce, which are then bought by the local restaurants and grocery stores. I think we can do that here. And I'm also interested in some of this vertical agriculture stuff. You know, if you look at the footprints of this, of an urban area, there's not a lot of green left. But I've seen these facilities built up against garages, like 15-foot extensions of garages with mechanized trays that just rotate all day long. And so they get the right amount of sun and they're watered, and they're not using pesticides or anything. These things are already up and working in other places, so we're going to try to figure out how do I do that here. I like the idea of employing people. The one in, I think it's out west somewhere, but not on the coast, employs a lot of disabled people. We have Red Wiggler Farm, which employs a lot
also
of
veterans.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we think there are ways to tie this to jobs. We think there are ways to actually build in urban areas and use land that I otherwise wouldn't use. And I'm really open to doing anything I can do, as long as I can find the money.
Thank you. It's past 8,
Is it
and
really?
I know we're going
I'm
to...
surprised Debbie wasn't up there.
We should let everybody know that Mark's coming back in December for a discussion more on the economic side, so we look forward to
With
that.
Michael Schumann, right?
Yes, Michael.
Is that confirmed? I think it's confirmed.
So before you head out the door, even if I get this pitch in, I'm looking forward, I'm sure we're all looking forward to the conversation on what we can explore in terms of the resources to ramp up the local, diverse table crop farming here in Montgomery County. So, because there will be the need for some resources. I know we try to make sure it's $0 thing, but like any other businesses we've supported in the county, local food production is going to need the support.
So processing, I know what I need. That's pretty clear. I mean, I get a space, I put equipment in it, I find people who want to process, that I can do. Getting the farmers to make the change to table crops, or at least to put aside some of their land for table crops, we're going to have to figure out how we assure them of the market.
Can I mention just MCPS, prisons,
Yeah.
the facilities?
I can deal-
That's guaranteed market. I mean,
So
that's
I
money
can
that
deal
we're
with,
already
I
spending.
can deal with the prisons. And so I'm open to working with people on,
Yeah.
nobody can deal with MCPS.
One of the reasons I'm so interested in institutional buying is it's money we're already spending. So we're spending that money
Right.
anyways, and so then when we turn around and we direct it, we have the ability to, so it's not adding, it's guaranteed contracts that we can offer without adding more money to, a budget that we don't have.
But you have to also deal with the seasonality of it. I mean, unless you're in greenhouses and hoop houses, certain food is only available certain times of the year. I'm only getting tomatoes and
We
lettuce.
should, That's true. We should have a follow-up conversation.
And you guys have changed people's diets to do what you want to do.
It's a little bit
That's maybe hard.
Thank you. We're waiting for Ginia Avery to arrive, but in the interim, I wonder if I could put Mike Houston on the spot here. He's on the manager of the Park. So thank you, Mark. Thank you. Keep standing up to the police.
Yeah. I'm trying to explain to them their flag has two meanings. And it's not their fault. I mean, I'll be honest. If you're in Cleveland, you see a thin blue line flag, you think of it as this old flag that represented this notion of the thin blue line. We can debate, the thin blue line means we're the barrier between civilization and barbarism in the most grotesque formulation. But the Blue Lives Matter movement appropriated the thin blue line flag, and so most of us who don't know about there being a thin blue line flag, you see that flag and you think Charlottesville, and you think racist, and I keep trying to explain it to these guys. That flag has been misappropriated by another group, and I can't help it when my residents look at this and it says you're supporting a hate group.
Yeah.
And they don't get it. Thank you.
So Mike, I wonder, as somebody who's in the interface between the producers and the consumers, can you say what needs to be done, what's working, what you might do to particularly address the issue of food equity?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what you support, I always say vote with your wallet. You want to support local businesses, support local businesses, and that's independent grocery stores. Obviously, that's small and local producers. All businesses that are coming out of DC has some great food incubators. They have Union Kitchen and Mess Hall and Tastemakers, and again on the Food Council, and there is a lot of interest in providing opportunities for those Montgomery County businesses, either small ones to be able to grow if they had some commercial facilities, or some of the people that are already producing and maybe producing outside the county to come back here and be able to scale up. But organic's really important. Most people view organic through the lens of their personal health, but it really came about because of ecological health. And so, by supporting organic, you're keeping harmful pesticides out of your body, but you're also keeping those out of the ground. And that's, we had to go to this system because after World War II, we started using DDT on crops and spraying apples so they ripened on the trees and didn't fall off naturally, and just all these things that we figured out a few decades later were hurting us. And so, but supporting organic, I think, is really important for thinking about the ecological impacts and thinking about how those items are grown. So yeah, to me, it just comes down to looking at what you spend on food, looking at whether you go to restaurants or grocery stores or however you're doing it, and just being really cognizant of what's going into your shopping cart, what's going onto your plate, and supporting the type of food system that you want to see.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions. We'll start with Zan if she has one.
Well, I had a comment when we were talking about building up the regional food system. I don't know if people are familiar with the Common Grain Alliance. It's a group mainly in Virginia, and somebody in this room connected me with that group via some email.
I don't think it was me, but I know.
You may know more about them than I do, but they're trying to bring grain growing within the Mid-Atlantic region, so that's kind of an exciting thing. Anyone knows of other organizations, I think those are the kinds of things we want to get on the record here so that we can really strengthen our network and support those.
So any ideas, questions for our resource people in particular, or just general comments? This side of the room isn't speaking a lot, but okay.
Yeah, just for everybody.
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry, my name is Mary Brooker. I'm with the Green Party. Everybody everybody that I know, all the experts, whether it's the United Nations or the Drawdown Project, they all talk about the importance of drastic changes to our diets. Drastic. Not just switching to grass-fed beef and backyard chickens. And in fact, backyard chickens are a real concern for me because I have a spring under my house, and I'm not even at the bottom of the hill. And that means that the waste from these chickens is going right into the water tables. It's really bad. So I'm not a backyard chickens advocate where the springs are there. In fact, Virginia law says if the water table isn't at least 100 feet below ground and there are any springs in the area, no backyard chickens. And that's Virginia.
Do you have a question for one of
Yeah, my question is, I know Finland had a dairy to berries program to help dairy farmers convert to berry growing, which was actually a more traditional Finland product anyway. And I'm wondering what proposals do you have that can help us all make these drastic changes to our diet, to what Drawdown calls our plant-rich diet?
One thing, there's a missing education with our kids and our consumers about what they do with vegetables. I hear from our CSA producers, community supported agriculture, that a lot of their consumers look at what they grow and they don't know what you do with okra, and they don't know, so educating people, starting with kids, about the types of food that are grown and how they can be prepared, I think is really important. Also making sure that the local markets, which many of them do, you probably do too, they provide resources for their consumers about what it is they can buy and what it is they can do with it.
Heather?
And I couldn't agree with Caroline more. The Food Council just did a food literacy assessment looking at what are the food education resources that are available in Montgomery County. And while there are a few groups that are doing really valuable work like Crossroads and Man Food Center and Capital Area Food Bank and Extension in some schools, there's so much room to grow. And if you compare to neighboring jurisdictions, like there's 50 different nonprofits in DC alone that are doing food education work. And so that takes resources, that takes commitment to reevaluating the curriculum, and also, and that's something that all residents of all ages need and could benefit from.
Phil?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Galen Tromble, and one of the hats that I wear is I work with a group that is doing training in Project Drawdown around the area. And some of you I know have been to some of the sessions. And we're very interested in building up a database, informal database of real projects, real actionable projects that are going on at the local level that relate to the drawdown solutions, many of which are food sector related. So that as we continue to deliver the drawdown training, we can give people examples of things happening in this area that they can get involved with. So if you've got any ideas about real projects that are going on that we could help, we could distribute through this training, let me know. Thanks.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the compost?
Say who you are.
Oh, Sarah Lynch. Could you talk a little bit more about the composting? Because I do think all these problems are so complicated to get into, but entry points. But everybody eats and everybody throws, food away, and so it's what we do with it. It's money lost. It's regenerative aspects lost. Any idea of how to take it to a larger scale? We in Takoma Park have our compost buckets we can access, but how do we take it to another scale and also put that infrastructure in, which is really essential?
So someone else may know more about sort of the science of compost than I do. Feel free to jump in. I'm happy to talk about my current plan as it relates to, so just at a state level, there's about maybe 8 or 9 states that have organic waste bans of some type. Some of the really progressive ones, Vermont, California, and I had to tell you, my colleagues in Annapolis love it when we show up and say, look at what California you got to do this here as well. So fortunately, also Connecticut and Rhode Island, and that's what I'm going to talk about this session. So Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, also a fan for replication. And a number of other ones have organic waste bans of some sort. So California and Vermont have them in sort of across the board. They include residential and so on. But some of these really, and most of them have started with organic waste bans for large generators.
Can you explain what, I'm assuming a waste ban means you don't
You
mix
can't
your
put it in,
organic with your regular.
you can't put it into landfill, and you can't send it to incinerators. And so as it relates to the large generators, and the reason that that becomes important is there's two things. One is that so any generator who, the legislation that I'm putting together, any generator, so restaurant, hospital, hotels who generate more than 2 tons of organic waste a week, sort of where we start, and then you can move down from there, can't send that to landfill or incinerator unless there's not a composting facility, organic waste recycling facility within, and then there's where we'll debate and compromise, and we'll see where it goes, 40 miles, 30 miles, 20 miles, whatever that ends up being. And what that does is that does two things. It creates sort of the economic incentive then for both private and public investment in the composting infrastructure. When you have the guaranteed market from the large generators, which is also cleaner and more efficient, right? So the household waste is really important to get composted, but the household waste tends to be more contaminated, so it costs more to sort of sort through your household waste. So when you have the large generators, which tends to be more sort of pure organic waste, it creates the economic incentive for then investment into that infrastructure because you have the sort of guaranteed market. And then once that infrastructure gets built out, then you can bring on more and more of the municipalities and the county curbside pickup sorts of compost. And so that's really the direction that I'm headed in. It's worth noting, like if folks are looking at what you want to work on this legislative session, this bill essentially, a version of it has come in 2014, 15, 16, 17. In 17 it became a study bill, and the Maryland Department of the Environment just recently put out the study. And it is 165 pages of uselessness. So you're welcome to go look at it if you got nothing else to do. It's worth reading the summary of it at least. Really a huge disappointment. It was supposed to look at how do we build out the compost infrastructure in the state, and it really kind of did nothing. But so it puts us in a position now, like you've had your shot at looking at it, we've tried studying it, and we've come up with nothing. And here's this. The one other thing that I want to say about the organic waste ban is the states that have done it, not only have they built out the compost infrastructure, but they've also, it's also resulted in more food donations. So food recovery from the useful, the still edible food, and directing that towards and addressing food insecurity, and as well as sort of keeping it out of any sort of waste system, recycling or otherwise. So it's had that effect, as well as increasing the infrastructure, which can then be used for the rest of the story, which I think folks know about once we put that in the organic materials into the ground.
So at the county level, there's a zero waste task force, and MCA sits on that. I sit on that task force, and composting has been central to the discussion. Food recovery has been central to the discussion because a full 30% or more of our waste stream is food, and much of that recoverable. So we have some programs that have been highly successful. MANA's Community Food Rescue, if you're not familiar with that, it's a terrific program. I'd love to see, and I think we should support not only that program, but more of those sort of satellite programs. And as far as composting goes, here's an irony. The area that was reserved for the Ag Reserve, 93,000 acres, has some of the crappiest soil in the county. And the idea of our being able to use our food waste and compost to improve that soil and improve our production and revitalize what in many cases as a result of inputs, chemical inputs, is dead soil. Now, let's just be clear, it's pretty much dead soil. That is going to be big. When we talk about game changers, one of them is going to be, and I'm sure most of you in this room will not balk at pay as you throw. That is one of the things. Are you familiar with what pay as you throw is? Everybody know what that is? That is the amount of trash that you throw out, like your electric bill or whatever, is what you pay for. And it's a real incentive, and it's worked well in other parts of the county. So waste is, that this is going to be a big part of our discussion in terms of how we respond to climate change here.
Just 2 comments on compost. There was a study done, I think it's 5 or 6 years ago now, Wendy Silver at one of the UC, I think it was Irvine. They have something called the Marin Carbon Project, They basically spread compost on a number of acres of field, about 1/4 of an inch thick. They found that 75–80% of that organic matter oxidized, but that there was a net benefit in drawdown because that compost carried microbes and fungi that then got into the soil and accelerated the natural drawdown of the pastures. There is also new technology coming around compost. We are most familiar with, putting it on a pile, turning it, whatever, or big windrows for some of these like veteran compost operation. But David Johnson and his wife, I forget what her first name is, last name is Sioux, they have something called the Johnson-Sioux Bioreactor, where basically they're building columns, 10, 15 feet high, loading it with compost in a particular order, and then letting it sit for 6 to 12 months so that those fungal and bacterial networks can develop and actually break down the matter and accelerate the life and the saturation of that material, which then when it's applied to the field, they're seeing, Gabe Brown is using some of the stuff on his ranches, and they're seeing like a 30% boost in productivity of the fields because of that kind of composting. And they're finding playing with the ratios of bacteria to fungi, and they're finding the 50%, 1-to-1 ratio is the one that works best. So if any of you want to experiment with your backyard compost system, it basically means some upfront work and then you let it sit for a while. So it's less labor intensive, and you might be able to improve your own soil quality. Kevin.
Most of what we've talked about so far has been more at the commercial scale or large scale, and if we're going to chip away at that 30% of the waste stream being food, obviously commercial scale generators are going to be a big component of that. But one of the things that the county has been working on, they launched a strategic plan to advance food waste composting about 1.5 years ago now. And Caroline and I both served, and I think maybe Seth too, on those working groups. And it was very intentionally structured to look at all the different places where compost can be processed. And so obviously large-scale facilities like Prince George's are going to be critical to have the capacity to process all this food waste, but backyard and community-scale composting are also important strategies, as well as on-farm. And there are some policy changes that potentially need to be made to increase opportunity for processing food waste as compost in your own backyard. But there are some great models to look at in DC and how they do community-scale composting that I think we could learn from. They use their community gardens as sites for both collecting and processing, and their farmers markets as well, and that's a citywide program. But also Pointer Farm right here in DC just launched in partnership with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and Sierra Club and other groups, and Bethesda Green and Food Council just had an event there last weekend. It's a community compost education hub, and that there will be others of those, and because connecting back to the need for food education, behavior change really starts with teaching youth and other residents on food waste and what you can do with it. And so those I'd encourage all of you to visit that hub and see more about what they're doing there, and then maybe there could be something like that in your community.
Where is that again, Heather?
It's in downtown Silver Spring.
Oh, that
Pointer Farm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment there too. It's just, it makes no sense that we have a diesel truck driving around picking up compost. Everyone used to have a composter in their backyard. It's just, everyone used to cook, it's an education problem.
Who does compost here? Not the, okay. So yeah, because I mean, those tumbler composter things, man, those are great.
Any questions back here?
You can compost things in Takoma Park with the city food waste collection. For those of you who are not vegan, meat products, for instance, oils that you wouldn't want to put in your backyard.
Right.
So I have a question, sort of like how we build support in the community to do this. We have a good turnout here, but this small, percentage of Takoma Park, people are going by going through life in their normal way, and so how do we ramp up this activity and the interest, and how, Lorig, can we support you politically from below to create some pressure on these things, as opposed to having to just sort of make the argument and convince people who really don't want to be convinced and are not, and are taking contributions from their own sorts of organizations.
So
Did you want to ask a follow-up before I answer that? No. So that, yeah, so a lot in there, thank you. I think, one of the interesting things when I was doing my campaign and doing like house parties around this, I've had sort of food systems as one of a handful of issues that I was highlighting. And generally in a state delegate race, you show up in someone's house party and start talking about food systems and people are like a little bit confused for a minute. But I felt like it was a really important opportunity to like bring this issue that like touches all of us, as I think everyone in this room knows, but like that is so crucial to everything that we do that most folks are not thinking about. But what I found that's interesting is, and not just in sort of like hippie house parties, but in all of the house parties across, and some of you hosted those for me, thank you. But in all of across the district, and then even now when I'm starting to do work tonight, I'm going to be in Southern Maryland, which is an agricultural area and not necessarily politically progressive, but people are thinking a lot because they can see very clearly how this sort of corporate-dominated, problematic food system is affecting their communities and their farmers. I do think that having the conversations is really important. People don't think about it, but when they start thinking about it, people become fascinated. So the number of people who would say to me, like, I never would have thought food policy is something, and I think probably you're finding this, like as you're elevating it, just really talking about it and helping people make the connections. But I also think what can be scary about talking about food policy is that people can feel judged really quickly. Because we all, and I know that the way that, I try really hard in the way that I just live my own life, and I've been vegan for 25 years, and I've, primarily purchased local, and I try to cook all the food myself for my kids, and, my son, to your point about how do you educate people, I'm just gonna brag about being a mother for a second, he'll go elsewhere and be like, why can't everyone cook broccoli the way you do? Because he fights for the seconds and thirds on the broccoli with his sister, but then he goes to school and he's like, what is this? And but even with all that, I know that, so I was at the movies the other day, someone was like, you eat popcorn? Sometimes. But I'll just mention, like, I'll be at an event and I'll be like, oh, is that vegan? Or like, I'll say that and people will start defending their choices to eat meat. I'm like, I'm not asking what you do, I'm just asking if I can eat that. So I think there's this real balancing act between recognizing the individual choices we can make and challenging ourselves to make the best choices possible for ourselves and our family, but also really recognizing, this is where I started, that it's not easy because of the structures that we operate in. So it's very easy to judge individuals and their choices without challenging the structures that make those choices so much easier to make, especially when people are struggling, working 3 jobs, barely able to kind of pay any of the bills when we do all the work on access and equity and doubling value of federal nutrition benefits and the realities of what those federal nutrition benefits and how far they don't go, and when you're just trying to get calories in your kids, all of it, whether you're struggling with food security or not, it's just very easy to get judgmental. And so I just think there's some thinking that we have to do around really challenging ourselves, both as individuals, but also really tying that as we talk to people about food so we don't lose them in that conversation, making sure that we're helping people think differently, but we're also helping them see the structural stuff that gets them trapped in those places, as well as the individual choices that they can make out of that, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the bigger picture question. I think what's interesting though, from a policy perspective about food, is we can get most, and I'm finding this as I'm building coalitions around building out the local food system. It is an area where we can do both across Republicans and Democrats. As I said, I'm going to be in Southern Maryland, which is a mostly Republican area. Republicans and Democrats, as well as across the spectrum of Democratic, progressive to sort of more centrist, where when you like the really basics of what we're talking about we are trucking in food from all over the place, and our farmers in this county, in this state, are struggling to stay, to keep their farms alive, is like some of the really basic stuff that we can all agree on. And so I think we sort of start with that low-hanging fruit, if you'll excuse the pun, and really move on it, even before we get to some of the stuff that maybe is more controversial, even among sort of progressive, so the stuff that sort of would be more progressive and more difficult politically to move. And so I think really, and that's really where I'm at right now, like this even in Maryland, where all my Republican colleagues agree with me that we should be buying more local food, no one has done the work to say structurally what are the things that keep us from doing that and how we're going to change it. So when I show up and start doing that work, they're willing to jump on board with me and put their names on my bill. And so I think that's, you know, we're so far from where we need to be. We're not even at the place where we have to get people to sign on to the Progressive platform yet on this one, just because there's so much more work where there is this sort of, if we just do the work, we can, if we just do the creative thinking, we have a lot of coalitions that would get behind that work. Is that useful as an answer?
Yeah, that helps. I want to know like how we can help you
specifically.
But also that generated another question, which is, are the small farms in Maryland feeling the kind of pressure that they are feeling in the Midwest, where larger, big ag is coming in and buying them up? Do we need to support them in a certain way, or are we sort of outside of that?
You can announce it.
Yes, so the pressures on our farmers, both large and small, are similar to the Midwest. The one positive, because I'd like to start with the positive, is that the consumer base is here. The question is how we aggregate, distribute, market, and those are resources that I'm hoping that the county and others will be able to help with. But the biblical rains, for example, that we had last year, the vagaries of, you know, what's happening with climate change has affected producers coast to coast. If anyone listened to Kojo Namde a couple of weeks ago, here in the state of Maryland, we're losing acres every year to saltwater intrusion, for example, and we haven't been able to figure out how to deal with that or what crops could possibly take place on that land now, although sorghum is a possibility. So do we need to support our local producers here? Are they challenged? Absolutely. And so those are the things that groups like this can help. We have some plans, I understand, that can help possibly with aggregation, distribution, that's going to be key. But, and as far as tariffs go, yes, that has affected local farmers here too. Our dairy farms, we've lost another one. The fact that we have someone coming from Madison, Wisconsin who started an organic dairy farm is cause for celebration, because we only have 3 left now in the county, and we do need to have local dairy production here, and it can be done in a sustainable way.
So here's an interesting thing about Maryland farmers, and I'll talk a little bit more about the legislation that we're putting together, because it's kind of exciting as it relates to this. In Maryland, we actually have one of the to protect our bay, we have some of the strongest nutrient management requirements in the country. And so even though there's so much more that we could be doing, and I think, you know, it's been talked about in terms of the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, but we do have to recognize that Maryland has some of the strongest nutrient management requirements compared to especially Pennsylvania, which is also a state that right now is really doing a lot of damage to our bay in terms of runoff, and they sort of, if folks haven't been sort of following this, you know, their argument is, why should we have to have, you know, we don't get any benefit from the bay. You, Maryland, get benefit from the bay, tourism, et cetera. We don't get any benefit, and you're asking us to, you know, put this pressure on our farmers to stop, you know, dumping as much manure into your bay, nitrogen and phosphorus into your bay, and so you know, there's this ongoing thing with Pennsylvania that I won't get too far into, except to say then there's this irony, because our definitions of local that a lot of our school systems use and our institutions use, who do brag about, we got 10% local, we got Anne Arundel County Public Schools is doing a lot more local, they're at 15%. But their definition is sort of a 100-mile radius or a 200-mile radius, which from a food shed perspective makes sense, but here's what that means for Maryland farmers. It means that they are internalizing the externalities of the impact on the bay, right? They're the ones who are paying for the nutrient management systems that we've put on them that I fully believe in and think, frankly, should be stronger. And then they're being undercut when all of our institutions go to Pennsylvania, call what they're doing local, and buy Pennsylvania farmers food, brag about local, and Maryland farmers are, you know, have the systems in place and are being undercut by Pennsylvania farmers who aren't internalizing the externalities of the bay. So So that's some of the picture around the local stuff that's interesting, and what we're excited about is the system that we're putting in place in Maryland, and this is the legislation we're coming in with, is gonna, and then there's also, there's interstate commerce clause issues that you can't just draw a line and say Maryland institutions are only buying from Maryland farmers because of interstate commerce issues. But here's what you can do. You can say that Maryland institutions are going to buy from farmers who are compliant with Maryland nutrient management standards. And then if Pennsylvania farmers want to become compliant with nutrient management standards in Maryland, they're welcome to do that, and they can have our prison, they can have our prison food contracts. So we're actually building out an office that'll be, there's debate about what we're calling it, bay-friendly foods or small, nutrient management certified friendly farm, something. I like bay-friendly foods. It's not as popular in other parts of the state. But this office is going to be, and it's going to be very simple because Maryland farmers are already sending in their nutrient management plans. They'll just have to check off a box, say, yeah, add me to that list. And then this list will be there, and then we're lining up our procurement laws so that in the same way that a contractor, large or small, has to demonstrate that they've tried to purchase from, for example, a minority-owned business to meet the MBE goals that we have as a state, they'll have to do the same thing when they're purchasing food with Maryland Bay-friendly foods or whatever we end up calling it, not Maryland, because theoretically it could be outside Maryland. So that we're lining up our now environmental policies as it relates to bay protection with our food procurement policies. And then it also puts us in a position over time as things like our healthy soils policies kind of get strengthened, which they're not really at the state level yet there. But then we have the ability over time to tie procurement points not only to Maryland, you're meeting the nutrient management standards for Maryland, but we'll be able to add points in procurement processes for doing a better job with healthy soils as that sort of kind of plays out. So it's a really exciting place to be. So the short answer is I have a couple pieces of legislation, would love your support on it. We could, I don't want to take up too much time about what that's going to look like, but those are the two pieces that kind of tie these together. And I think it'll take a few years we may get some of the legislation through this year. It'll take a few years to fully fund that and build that out. So it'll be a couple-year project to make that happen.
Heather?
Is it okay to just follow up on that really quickly? What I love about events like this is it creates ambassadors around these issues in your own communities and carries this story forward in lots of different directions. And we are so lucky to have elected leadership that champions these issues and highlights them as food issues, because so often food is built into so many different things, but we don't talk about it as a unique challenge and its own system. So I would encourage all of you to follow the legislation that happens. We have a food advocacy listserv that anybody's welcome to join if you want to stay up to date, particularly in the Maryland legislative session, about where you can what's happening. But then just to tie back to there are challenges when we're talking about climate emergency, and there's the need for action, which I completely agree with. To also understand or be committed to understanding the subtleties and not taking absolutes in approaching these issues, and particularly engaging with different communities. And so just building on what the delegate shared about the different challenges that farmers are under and in the structures in which they operate, knowing that there is organic, there's also certified naturally grown. One of the benefits of engaging and buying local is, at farmers market or in other places, you can talk with the producer about what are their practices and what are their challenges. And doing a lot of listening in this work has been really valuable to me, because there's a lot of conversations about farmers that don't necessarily involve them, and I can't speak for them in any way, but I think it's important, as was shared before, like Caroline said, to bring as many different agricultural producers' perspectives into these conversations. And so going to where they are as well and listening whenever you have opportunities to do that, because we're saying you need to grow the food. You need to do it in these ways, and in these structures in which it's really difficult to find access opportunities and sustain your business. And so how can we do this in a way that works for everybody and allows our farms to thrive, but also meets our needs for increasing food access and the environmental goals that we have as well. So.
I want to hold questions. I want to welcome Ginia Avery. We saved you a seat. I know you're at a disadvantage. at disadvantage of not hearing all other resource people, but we wanted to give you 5 minutes to talk about what we're trying to do in Anacostia, and welcome. It's grateful you could make it with us. So say who you are, what you're working on.
Okay, Ginia Avery. I'm with the Community Grocery Cooperative. We are a startup, community-led and consumer-based cooperative that's going to start up in Ward 8 and Ward 7. In Washington, D.C., I'm sorry. So we're in the beginning stages of the cooperative foundation. So we are incorporated, we are now, we've got our bylaws, we've done all those things, so now we're working on the membership. So the last 2 years we've been going throughout the community, educating the community, just saying, you know, aren't you sick and tired of waiting for Walmart or waiting, you know, for somebody to come and decide your food choices? And so we're getting a lot of good response from that. We began because in 2014 or so, Walmart was coming into DC, and the mayor at that point said, well, you know, we're going to have one in Ward 8, or we're not going to build any of them. So everybody knew that that was never going to happen, and of course it didn't happen. They were every other place that everybody else didn't want, you know, but the place that supposedly it was needed. So a group of citizens just got together and said, you know, this doesn't make sense. You know, not only did they close, but then a Murray's, I don't know if you know that, that's a grocery store, closed also. So we just decided that we're going to get together and we're going to not ever allow another major institution to decide if we have fresh foods, if we don't have fresh foods in the community. So right now in Ward 8 and 7, there are only like 2 major grocery stores. And so a lot of people are just going to Maryland, going other places. And so what we want to do is we want to create a store, but it's got to be driven by what the community says it wants. And it's got to be at least 50% of the community members have to have the voting block, or we will not open that particular facility. So that's what we're doing now. We're out talking to the community, trying to get people invested in the process. We have people working on business plans, feasibility plans, all kinds of fundraising and things of that nature. So once we have, there's a process in the co-op movement. So at 300 people, then you go to the next stage, and then you go to the next stage up until you get 2,000 owners is what they call it. And by that time, you would have bonded with the community, you would have created community unity, and you will have a path so that you know exactly what the community needs. And then you will, you know, select the general manager and all those other people so that you actually become a community institution is what we want to become. So, and from that, we're hoping that we'll have enough space to do pop-ups, to have outdoor concerts like you have at Takoma Park, start some businesses and delivery services, so that, you know, people in the community will own, run it, and then also create wealth from that little store that we finally get. So those are our goals.
So if you haven't already, thank you, congratulations on your initiative, and wish you every success. If you haven't already met Heather Bruskin, our representative, Lorig Charkoudian, Carolyn Taylor from the Montgomery Countryside Alliance, which is protecting the Ag Reserve, and others here will come up afterwards and offer you ideas and support. We try to end at 9. We can stay afterwards for a little while if people want to kind of all day. Some of us have to actually get to work. But Carolyn wanted to talk about Thrive 2050?
I just wanted to mention, is everyone familiar that the county is undertaking an update of our general plan? Good, so you guys are, well, some of you aren't. It's called Thrive 2050. Much good could come of it. Much mayhem could come of it. Right now, it's tending towards the mayhem because we're not looking at the 2 central issues that we mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, and that is climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and equity issues. So I strongly recommend that you take a look at the website, There is input that you can give. If you look at the survey, it reads like a developer's push-pull. Debbie?
I was just going to say the county executive will be involved in the issue going forward, so we're hoping to be helpful in that in terms of information as well.
Right.
Could you just say, what is Thrive 2020? Who's doing it?
It's, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning, Montgomery County.
Okay.
That's a big mouthful.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a trend towards pretty much putting impervious on every square inch, and certainly there is no affection for the one place we've reserved for open space and farmland preservation in the county. It's pretty shocking to read some of what they have put forward in their survey. So people need to plug in, and we need to be heard and make sure that we make the big changes that are going to make sure that we do those things that we claim are central to our beliefs here.
Are there decision points that we need to know about or that we can organize around?
Right, so that timetable is on their website, Thrive 2050. Right now is important because we are trying to get that ship headed in at the early right direction before we go way off course. But the other sort of decision points will be in there. There'll be public hearings. There's plenty of opportunity for public participation. But again, we're busy. I mean, we got 65,000 other things to do, but this one's important. This is a general plan. This will guide all else. People will lean on it. They're going to either lean on it for good or they're going to lean on it for not good. So.
Okay, I want to wrap up. I want to give Suzanne an opportunity to tell you what's upcoming with our climate action coffees here. I want to express deep appreciation to all our resource people for taking and grateful that you got here. I hope we can engage you more fully in going ahead.
And Phil, can we make sure Gina knows the other co-op person?
TPSS was our connection to GMAT.
Yes.
And before we break up, I'm going to change the phrase, are there any burning issues are there any growing issues that people would like to raise? Yes.
I just wanted to invite everyone today on Wednesday to the Crossroads Farmers Market. We're open every Wednesday through November. And just as I look at some of those framing questions, we're a market made up of primarily immigrant vendors, immigrant shoppers. It's only a mile and a half east of here. We're open from 11 to 3. So it really touches on a lot of the issues that you all spoke to today. So
And tell us who you are.
I'm Christy Balls from Crossroads Community Food Network. So.
And others, and we should also express our appreciation for Busboys and Poets and providing this forum.